Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can't even remember the last time I got up as early as I did this morning, 6 o'clock, I think. First of all, can you all hear me okay? Yes? Good. All right. So, as Rickard very kindly said, I came in from Paris to be here with you today. And I want to give a short presentation of the project that I have been doing since 2009, which is a fashion journal, I prefer to say, because it's a little bit different, and you will see in which ways than regular fashion magazines. We started 3 years ago. This journal is annual, so we have one issue per year, and every time we deal with a different theme. So the first issue was about material memories or clothing and nostalgia. The second one dealt with fashion and magic, and the third one, which came out earlier this year, dealt with fashion and shame. And when we started this project, we had a bunch of ideas and ideals that we thought were really important to keep in mind as we were going along in this process. So very early on, we wrote a super serious manifesto, and that's what you can see up on the screen here. And I'm going to read it to you just to start off, so you get a little bit of a sense of what Vestoj is all about. So, point number 1. All articles must relate to sartorial issues. We are interested in people's relationship to their clothes and fashion's relationship to identity. Point number 2. We must bridge academia and industry. We will place academia and industry side by side and give equal significance to both. We will place the academic in an industry context and vice versa in order to increase the understanding and collaboration between these two fields. We will work for the greater good of our discipline. Point number 3. Fashion must always be taken seriously. We must never be afraid to have pretensions. We are as interested in the minutiae of clothing as we are in the grand themes of fashion. We will see the trivial in the substantial and the substantial in the trivial, and ensure that all is given equal importance. 4. The tone must be inviting. We must never be excluding in language or in approach. We will use humor to draw readers in and themes that many can relate to. 5. Text and image shall be given equal importance. We must always integrate word and picture and guarantee that there is an ongoing dialogue between the two. 6. Everything shall be questioned. Nothing is holy. We must challenge the status quo. We must always ask why. 7. We must always remain independent in thought and action. We must actively encourage critical thought and never be satisfied until we've examined every theme intrepidly. We will keenly promote criticism and draw attention to the paradoxes within the fashion world. Point 8. Advertising is forbidden. Point 9. The reader's intellect must be as gratified as her aesthetic sense. We will encourage creativity as well as an intelligent discourse. We will take nothing for granted. And lastly, point 10. We will have an interdisciplinary approach. We will take care to examine each theme from various angles and make certain that we represent other lifestyles and ethos to our own. We will work from within the fashion world, but maintain an outsider's perspective. I think this last point that I just mentioned is a really important one, in fact. and it's one that we are trying very much to keep in mind as we go along in this process, that is the development of Vestoj. To us, it's very important to, in order to bridge these two fields that we want to take care to be inclusive of, academia on the one hand, as far as fashion and dress is concerned, and the fashion industry on the other hand, is for both to feel that we are a sort of insider, that however we approach the theme we're dealing with, we'll never stand just on the outside and point fingers, but rather be on the inside and shout, if you like. We wanted very much, when we started Vestoj, for the journal to be a sort of alternative to this sort of plethora of fashion magazines that you can find on the shelves today. Magazines that, to us at least, tend to look remarkably similar, a very kind of samey format with short pieces at the front, a certain number of fashion stories, shall we say, interviews set up in a similar way, advertising that then influences the products that go into the editorial content or the fashion stories. For us, we wanted very much to be able to be free in our expression, which is why this point of advertising being forbidden is also really important to us. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys work in the creative industries or in the fashion world, but I think as consumers and readers are becoming more and more sophisticated in our knowledge and in our taste, more and more of us are realizing this sort of game that is going on behind the scenes, or the kind of politics that magazines don't write about. Say, for example, if a big company advertises in a magazine like an Elle or a Vogue, or a smaller one like the ones on the Swedish market that we have, inevitably you will find the same company's products popping up inside of the magazine. Maybe it's an article, maybe it's an interview with a designer, maybe it's a whole fashion story dedicated to this particular brand, or maybe it's just one item popping up with a regular basis. To me and to the colleagues that I work with, this is a really, really difficult climate to work within, because it means that as creators or as writers, journalists, editors, our integrity feels compromised. So what to do if you find yourself in this conundrum where you want to be sure that the reader takes what you say as what you actually mean? You have to work without advertising, or at least that's as far as we got in our thinking. So that's a really important point for us as well. The other thing that we thought a lot about when we started was also how to take an academic discourse around fashion and dress and present it to people who are not academics and who don't have an interest of working in the academic field, but who still are interested in thought-provoking content or in the themes that are explored by the academic world. So we try very much to take these sort of themes, use academic writers, but always ask them to present in a way that feels approachable, easily understandable. And then we illustrate it also, often by showing, say, a text to a group of image makers, a photographer or an illustrator or a stylist, let's say, and then we ask them to interpret this. So then you have the two sides, the industry side and the academic side, working together, and Vestoj being this bridge in between the two. Early on, we also decided that to be extra clear with this bridge that I was just mentioning, we set up an editorial advisory board. And the editorial advisory board help us to make sure that we have equal components from both these worlds. For those of you who sit close enough to see the people on the board, or later if you want to have a look in the journals themselves, you'll see that around half of these people are people who work within various academic institutions. The Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, Central St. Martin's in London, Stockholm University here in Stockholm, and so on. And then the other half are people who work within the industry, people like Hamish Bowles, who works for American Vogue, or Sarah Mower, who is one of the key players now in the British Fashion Council and who also writes for Style.com. Nathalie Ours, who is a big PR agent with about 2 decades of experience based in Paris, and so on. So the way that we work with this board is that before we start every topic and every new issue of Vestoj, we go to them and we ask them, okay, this is what we're dealing with. We have this and this sort of approach or idea or way we want to develop the topic. What do you think? Do you have any ideas of people who might be really useful for the topic we're dealing with? Maybe you yourselves would like to contribute in some way. So it's very much a mixture of, shall we say, patronage, ideas, and also financial support when needed. What you see here is me flicking through the first issue. The first issue, as I mentioned right at the beginning, came out in 2009. It dealt with memories and with nostalgia. I had a bit of a history with this theme in particular because when I finished my master's thesis in London at the Royal College of Art, this was in fact the topic that I was dealing with, what I wrote my thesis on. So I had like a vast well, shall we say, of knowledge to pull from. So it was a really thankful topic to start with. And also really interesting because vintage and second-hand clothing have been so incredibly popular in mass culture for the last 10 years or so. So in this issue, we wanted to talk about old clothes as a sort of mark of distinction, if you like, as a way to connect a real and an imagined past, or as a way to toy with different characters from our collective memory. We also talked about nostalgia, real or imagined. We talked about historicism in fashion, i.e. designers using inspiration from the past to create new collections today. And we talked to people about their personal memories of pieces of clothing that they had loved or cherished throughout a long time, maybe a piece that belonged to their mother or grandmother, or maybe something they picked up in a charity shop or in a vintage boutique and then proceeded to love and give a new kind of life. In short, I guess this issue could be said to be a sort of account of the intersection between our clothing and our past. We had people like Professor Caroline Evans from St. Martin's in London writing about fashion photography and melancholy. We had Professor Peter McNeill, who at the time was working between University of Technology in Sydney and Stockholm University here, who wrote about the Prince of Wales, also known as the Duke of Windsor, as a sort of one of the last of the dandies. Or, he was saying, perhaps one of the first subculturalists. We had Professor Elizabeth Wilson, who is a very big and cherished name within fashion theory, writing about memory, fashion and memory fetish. We had Professor Patrizia Calefato writing about vintage, revival and reuse. We had photographer Carlotta Manaijo, an Italian photographer, who gave us a very personal portfolio of images of her mother. We had the musician Lydia Lunch, who I remember, in fact, interviewing here at Barnes, in 2009, talking about her Canadian aunt and the way that this woman has influenced the complete style that Lydia Lunch herself uses today. And we had musician David Byrne, who talked about the stage costumes that his then wife created for him throughout the beginning of his very long and illustrious career, and lots of other things, of course. This here is the second issue of Vestoj. You can see it also on the table in front of you. Here we dealt with fashion and magic. We started thinking about fashion and dress, whether worn by a shaman or shown on a catwalk, as a sort of, shall we say, system that speaks very directly to our dreams and desires in both cases. We thought that for both fashion and magic, you need wonders, rituals, you need myths, revelations, and the prediction of the future, as well as both symbolic and tangible fireworks. And we thought it was so interesting that both of these systems depend very much on an inherent belief. I mean, with magic, for instance, you believe or you don't. If you don't believe, the system, it fails. And fashion is very much the same thing. It's set up with a sort of host of symbolic rules that you either buy into and enjoy with, I don't know, all the plethora in between, like knowing which designer is extremely valuable and what type of clothing you can buy, wear, and then throw out. Magic, of course, being the same. We thought it was so interesting to see this connection between two topics that perhaps at first sight you wouldn't know how to connect them. We also thought it was quite funny how the alchemist in magic has this thorough search for youth. And in fashion, of course, it's very much the same thing, a kind of quest for youth that just never ends. We looked at clothes as talismans. We looked at Dorothy and her red shoes in The Wizard of Oz. We looked at the magician and his top hat, the priest and his cassock. And we thought about whether a necklace or a hat or a robe could ever be seen as a sort of portal to another world. We had people like Dr. Alistair O'Neill from St. Martin's again, writing on Orson Welles, who made an incredible cover for an old American Vogue. We had an interview with the filmmaker Kenneth Anger, who talked about the costumes that he used and made himself in the films that he created in the 60s and 70s. We had the American photographer David Armstrong create a beautiful portfolio of images with clothes from the Japanese designer Yohji Yamamoto. We had the set designer Simon Costin, who worked always with Alexander McQueen in the beginning of his huge, enormous catwalk shows, who it also turned out was a magical practitioner himself. So he went out and interviewed his peers about the robes that they use when they create magical rituals, what it's like when they put them on, what sort of rituals they go through when they take them off again. And we had the Stockholm-based writer Julie Cirelli write a really curious piece on the late Haitian dictator François Duvalier, who styled himself after the voodoo god of Baron Samedi. And again, of course, many, many other things. You can see for yourself afterwards. This here is the third and last issue. We launched it in June this year at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. And we did a kind of special piece for the launch of this issue. We had the French actress Clémence Poésy, who helped us gather a group of about 20-25 actors together. And we put a performance on, but it was secret. So we told each one of these actors that they would embody a different idea of clothing or fashion and social shame. So, for instance, we had one girl that had her skirt hiked up into her knickers. We had someone else who was tripping around on high heels that were way too high for her to walk in, so she kept falling over. Or we had a guy who was beautifully turned out in a tuxedo and super well slicked, combed hair. Very handsome, a model in fact, and he was reeking of sweat. We had another guy who was so keen on walking up to everybody and start talking, even though he didn't know them. You know, these kind of really annoying social kind of pests that you can never get rid of once they start talking to you at a party. And on top of that, he had his teeth full of various bits and bobs, shall we say. In any case, we didn't tell any of the regular guests that this was going to happen during the evening. So when people arrived, it was beautiful to see like how they either started whispering to each other or maybe took a few steps to the left or to the right to get away from the people that were weird, or very funnily started noticing people that we hadn't in fact asked in any way to act or dress weird, as if they were part of this performance also. In this issue, we were really interested to look at the difference between shame and guilt. And we thought from the start that shame is so interesting in comparison to guilt because it depends on the relationship that we have to others. Classically, guilt is defined as something that we feel in direct connection to our morals and ethics. So let's say we've done something really bad, nobody knows about it, but we still feel awful. Shame, on the other hand, is much more connected to our social world. For instance, you can walk into, this is a super simple example, walk into a lamppost in the street. Bam, you fall down on the ground, and immediately you get up, start looking around. Did anybody see what just happened? If nobody saw, well, you can like rub your head and cry or whatever, and then get on with your day. If someone saw you, of course you got to pretend as if everything is perfectly fine, you didn't hurt yourself, and just like keep wandering off into the night. We also looked a lot at the symbolic birth of mankind. We thought this was a really interesting and curious example. When Adam and Eve were banished from paradise, quite curiously, this was the beginning of consciousness. It was the beginning of self-consciousness. And it was, of course, also the beginning of clothing and of shame. So with this as a sort of symbolic starting point, shall we say, we started looking at all the different types of clothing that have been used throughout history to shame us. We looked at an object like the scold's bridle, which was a kind of contraption made of metal, often styled as a donkey's head, that were put onto women in the 17th century in particular to keep them quiet as a punishment for gossip. So this kind of metal donkey's head would have a sort of contraption that went into the mouth and pressed down on the tongue of the woman wearing it. We looked at other classical examples like the dunce's cap, this kind of triangular hat that little children were forced to wear if they had misbehaved in the classroom. We looked at the scarlet letter. We looked at the Star of David. We looked at the pink triangle that homosexuals were forced to wear during the Second World War. We looked at prison uniforms. And we looked at, as I talked a little bit about just now, the shaming potential of clothes in everyday situations. Like for girls, this, I don't know, I speak maybe only for myself, but the horror of having your period and having blood leaking through the garments that you wear, how awful. Or having, say, a white bathing suit, beautiful, really expensively bought, you swim and it becomes see-through. We looked, or we were thinking of, you know, those moments when you come out of the bathroom and you forgot to zip up your flies. I mean, we've looked at at as many different situations, if you like, in which fashion or dress forces us to both judge ourselves and judge others. And we thought about how fashion forces us to face up to the shame of not belonging. The shame being imposed on other people for not dressing the part. The shame of not being able to participate in fashion, either because you have a body type deemed wrong, or let's say a wallet too meager. We looked also at the areas within the fashion industry that are often used by others outside of the industry, this idea of pointing fingers that I mentioned earlier. The ways that fashion is shamed, shall we say, in the eyes of the outside world. We looked at child labor. We looked at the overproduction and consumption of goods. We looked, of course, at environmental damage. We looked at the narrow ideals of beauty that we have today. And we looked at fashion as a system that is easily condemned, a fashion that's often, or a system that's often deemed to be superficial, fickle, frivolous, or indulgent. But we also looked at fashion as a sort of zone where most, shall we say, level-headed people among us, well, we allow ourselves to sin, despite the fact that we know all about child labor, overproduction, overconsumption, environmental damage, and so on. Still, we very willingly participate. So with this in mind, we looked at fashion as a sort of zone where it's in fact allowed to be bad, where it even feels good to be bad. So in the issue, we had articles like this one, which was an interview between Dr. Niall Richardson, a London-based academic, and a queer female-to-male icon called Buck Angel, shot here by the Swedish photographer Christian Cronberg. The Swedish writer Lisa Elin from Stockholm University wrote about racism in Vogue. I myself wrote about prison uniforms, both the history of the uniform, how it's gone from stripes and arrows to later orange jumpsuits that are still being used in parts of America today, to when the prison uniform in many areas of the Western world was successively, how shall we say, decreased to a time where today in many prisons people don't use uniforms at all. And we looked as well at what happens, in fact, to the sense of control that an institution such as a prison can exercise over its prisoners, whether they use uniforms or no uniforms. So classically, the idea would be that when you come in as a prisoner to an institution, you have to leave everything, all of your old identity at the door, and you have to take on this state-issued uniform and the same haircut as everybody else, and have your identity erased, to slowly having it being rebuilt again in a way that fits society so that you can eventually be let out again. So with this in mind, the idea of wearing no uniforms seems incredibly liberating. But you can also have a look at it from another point of view, which could be that if we see clothes, our own clothes, as a marker of identity, well, when we wear them in an environment as tightly controlled as a prison, it's also another way for the authorities to observe you. And if they can observe you and the way that you wear your clothes and what that signifies, either for what sort of subculture you belong to, or the group in prison that you pledge your allegiance to, or all the other little signs and symbols that we put out when we dress in the morning, well, they get to know the prisoners better. And if they get to know the prisoners better, they will also be able to find more sophisticated ways of control. This piece, or this image, comes from an article written by the Yale graduate Anna Arabinden Kessen, who wrote her thesis about how slave dress was used in colonial times, and the relationship, shall we say, between slave markets, where the slaves were told by their owners to dress up in the most exclusive, expensive, cherished clothing that they owned. That was a requirement. Of course, then they looked good to the owner or to the prospective new owners. But at the same time, what did it do to the identity of the slaves? To come to associate the most cherished piece of clothing that you own with the most shameful kind of circumstance that you could ever imagine being in. We had an American academic, Dr. Brenda Weber, who wrote a piece for us about TV makeovers. And she talked particularly about this very curious development or part of the TV makeover story. I mean, you remember the TV makeover, so popular about 10 years ago or so. Always the person who is being made over is being shuttled into either a changing room or onto a street where there's a huge billboard of an image of them naked, and then passers-by judge them. She looks 20 years older than what she actually is. She's really fat. Her hair is a mess or whatever. Or she stands in the changing room, mirrors on all sides, and the savior, helper, stylist is telling her all the areas of her body or her look that she needs to change in order to look, well, if not beautiful, then normal. Vestoj's editor, Dr. Ane Lynge Jorlén, wrote about fashion trespassing. So she looked at 3 different designers: Hussein Chalayan, whose collection this image is based on. I think it's from, 90s or something like that. She looked at Comme des Garçons, a very particular collection called colloquially lumps and bumps, or dress meets body meets dress. And it was these sort of incredibly odd garments in a gingham check with really big hunchbacks or big kind of pillows built into the clothing on the side that completely morphed the body into something weird, maybe shameful, a play on that at least. And she also looked at Vivienne Westwood and a particular garment that Westwood created in the 80s, which was a pair of tights with a fig leaf on them. So back again to where we started with Adam and Eve. We had the Paris-based philosopher Donatien Grau, who wrote about the difference between being naked and being nude. We had the London-based professor Raina Lewis, who sits at London College of Fashion, who wrote about dress and modesty, or rather religious dress. So she looked at Hasidic Jews, she looked at traditional Muslim dress, and she looked at very conservative Christian faiths like the Mormons, and then compared the way that these 3 groups or religions use clothing and interpret modesty into their dress. And to accompany this article, Vestoj's fashion director, Stockholm-based stylist Sophie Krunegård, created a story together with the photographer Julia Hetta that was their type of interpretation of fashion and modesty. We had the American photographer Jen Davis, who takes only self-portraits. So this is her that you see in the image. Give us a portfolio of images that was her interpretation of the theme fashion and shame. And as you can see, her body type doesn't fit into the classic ideal of beauty according to the fashion industry, shall we say. So her work always deals with or experiments with the idea of being a wrong body. We had the New York-based designer Thomas Engelhardt and the American writer Hannah Smith Drellish, who made a sort of collaboration based on these gossip magazines that, like Heat or whatever the Swedish equivalents are, where you typically have images of celebrities with certain areas of their bodies marked out, circled in, and then pointed to, whether it's a jelly belly or a sweat stain or whatever it is that can be considered to be shameful. And the little text on the side is a riff or a spoof on a famous little song from The Sound of Music. My Favorite Things, it's called. This one here is, well, shall we say, a collection of images found by the photographer Jason Evans, who worked a lot for magazines like ID when it first started in the 1980s. So this was his idea of what shamelessness means. A bunch of guys in body paint on bicycles. So before we end, I want to tell you just a little bit about the theme that we're working on now, which is the 4th issue of Vestoj, which is going to deal with fashion and power. So the idea with this issue is that it's going to be a close look at how fashion and power interacts. So what are the rules in fashion and who sets them? We're really keen to look closer at topics like money, ideals, politics, ideology, and also try and understand how the politics of fashion allow power relationships to be both built and then maintained. We're going to look at how dress can be a powerful weapon of control and also dominance, and how it can at the same time also be incredibly subversive and empowering, because that, after all, is what's so incredibly fascinating, I find, with the fashion industry or with clothing in general. It's both. It's good, empowering. It's bad, takes your power away. So we want to explore the link between power, social discipline, conformity, and fashion. And we want to also examine how contemporary norms can be so entrenched so that they are beyond even our discernment. We don't notice them. And yet, it causes us to regulate the way that we look and dress. And we control ourselves without any deliberate coercion from anybody. In other words, we have internalized the rules of the game. We don't need anyone to tell us what to wear, what not to wear. We know. But if that's the case, what then happens when you break the rules? And personally, I'm also particularly curious about how demonstrations of power within the fashion industry are displayed and why so few people are willing to criticize them. I want to find out whether that type of power relationship is in some way endemic to society at large. And I also want to look at the critical climate in contemporary fashion. Why is it so hard to be critical in fashion today? And then I want to look at who is it then that gains from the industry's very rigid and static power structure. And in light of all of this, we want to ask whether it's in fact possible even to challenge the status quo. And if it's possible, how do you do it? Thank you very much. If you have any questions.